The real King Arthur. Was there ever a historical figure? Mist rolled across the hills of western Britain in the early 6th century. Below, exhausted men stood behind a rough wall of stone and earth, gripping wet spears with frozen hands. Some still wore pieces of old Roman armor inherited from fathers who had once served an empire that no longer existed. Beyond the hill came the sound of horns. The Saxons had already burned villages across the countryside. Now they marched toward a final line of defense led by a war commander whose name would echo through history. No one there called him a king. The battle that followed became legend. Later writers claimed this man ruled from Camelot, carried a magical sword, and commanded noble knights. Yet the deeper truth was stranger than the myth itself. The real mystery was not whether Arthur conquered Britain. It was whether he had existed at all. For centuries, the world believed it knew King Arthur. He was the noble ruler of Camelot, the master of the Round Table, the man who pulled a sword from stone. His story felt fixed in place, too famous to question. But almost every familiar detail came from writers who lived hundreds of years after Arthur was supposed to have died. The castles, the shining armor, even the image of Camelot belonged more to the Middle Ages than to Arthur's own world. Behind the legends stood something darker. A collapsing Britain abandoned by Rome, tribal warlords fighting through smoke and mud, and a mysterious leader whose victories may have delayed the destruction of an entire civilization. The story held 3 surprises most people never heard. Arthur may never have been a king at all. Camelot probably did not exist. And one forgotten battle may have changed the future language and culture of Britain itself. So who was Arthur really? A myth created by desperate people, or the memory of a real man history failed to preserve? When Roman rule collapsed in Britain during the 5th century, the island entered a violent age of uncertainty. For almost 400 years, Rome had controlled the land with roads, forts, taxes, and law. Roman soldiers guarded the borders. Roman officials settled disputes. Roman towns connected Britain to a vast empire stretching across Europe. Then Rome withdrew. Around the year 410, the legions sailed away. Britain fractured into small, competing kingdoms. Trade weakened. Cities shrank. Stone buildings slowly fell apart beneath wind and rain. And from across the North Sea came new invaders. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes arrived first as hired warriors, then as settlers, and finally as conquerors. Some British rulers invited them to fight local enemies. Soon those same mercenaries turned against their employers. Ordinary life became harsh and dangerous. Farmers abandoned land near the eastern coast because raids came without warning. Families slept beside hidden weapons. In some regions, literacy nearly vanished. Yet the age was not entirely dark. Archaeologists later discovered imported Mediterranean wine reaching western Britain even during these chaotic years. The old Roman world had not completely disappeared. It survived in fragments. And that was why Arthur's story mattered. Because Arthur, if he existed, stood between 2 worlds, Roman Britain dying behind him and medieval Britain waiting ahead. Surprisingly, the earliest sources never described Arthur as a crowned monarch. They suggested something far more practical, a military commander leading British tribes against Saxon invasions. That detail changed everything. The legend of a perfect king may have grown from the memory of a battlefield leader holding together a collapsing society by force alone. Then came the unsettling truth. There was no contemporary record of Arthur from his own lifetime. Not one. That silence haunted historians for centuries. Somewhere in western Britain, perhaps in Wales or Cornwall, a real child may still have grown up hearing stories about Rome's vanished glory. If he survived long enough, he entered a brutal world where victory meant survival for entire peoples. And survival became his first test. The earliest major clue appeared in a text called Historia Brittonum, written centuries later. It described Arthur fighting 12 battles against the Saxons. At the Battle of Mount Badon, the writer claimed Arthur shattered the enemy advance and saved Britain from collapse. The details were almost certainly exaggerated. Yet one fact drew serious attention from historians. Around the late 5th or early 6th century, Saxon expansion truly did slow down for several decades. Something happened. Someone organized resistance strong enough to halt an invasion that had seemed unstoppable. Could one man really have changed the fate of Britain for a generation? Arthur's greatest enemy may not have been a single rival at all. It may have been time itself. Britain had fractured into isolated kingdoms ruled by ambitious warlords. Alliances shifted constantly. Loyalty often lasted only until the next harvest or the next raid. Even the legends hinted at betrayal. Later stories transformed this fear into Mordred, the traitor who destroyed Arthur from within. Whether Mordred existed mattered less than what he represented. In unstable societies, collapse often came from allies before enemies. Then came the turning point. Around the year 500, British forces achieved a major victory at Mountbatten. A monk named Gildas, writing within living memory of the event, described it as a moment when the British took the victory in accordance with the will of God. Strangely, Gildas never mentioned Arthur by name. That omission created one of history's greatest debates. If Arthur truly led the battle, why did the closest writer to the event remain silent? Some historians believed Arthur was simply one commander among many. Others suspected his legend absorbed the deeds of several real warriors over time. And still the stories grew. By the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth transformed Arthur into a near-superhuman king. Camelot appeared. Merlin entered the tale. Arthur conquered lands far beyond Britain. But Geoffrey wrote 600 years after Arthur supposedly lived. The historical figure, if one existed, had already disappeared beneath layers of myth. At the height of the legend, Arthur became more than a warrior. He became a symbol of order itself. In stories, his round table gathered powerful men as equals, an astonishing idea in a deeply unequal age. Yet the real achievement behind the myth was probably simpler and more fragile. If Arthur existed, he may have united rival British groups long enough to resist complete conquest. That delay mattered enormously. Wales and parts of Cornwall remained culturally British rather than fully Saxon. But greatness carried a cost. The legends constantly returned to division, jealousy, and betrayal. Arthur won battles, yet failed to hold together the people closest to him. His kingdom cracked from internal tension as much as outside attack. Then came the final collapse. In later stories, Arthur marched against Mordred at Camelot. The battle destroyed nearly everyone involved. Arthur himself fell mortally wounded and was carried away to Avalon. It sounded mythical. Yet beneath the poetry lay a recognizable truth about post-Roman Britain. Small kingdoms often destroyed themselves through endless cycles of civil war. The dream of stability died almost as quickly as it appeared. And perhaps that was why Arthur endured in memory. People remembered him not because he built a perfect kingdom, but because he almost did. No grave could ever be identified with certainty. Medieval monks later claimed they discovered Arthur's tomb at Glastonbury Abbey. But many historians believe the story was invented to attract pilgrims after a devastating fire. Yet the legend refused to die. Across Britain, people continued believing Arthur had not truly perished. He merely slept somewhere beneath the hills, waiting for the moment Britain needed him again. And the central question finally revealed its difficult answer. There was probably no single King Arthur exactly as legend described him. No shining monarch ruling Camelot with magical swords and armored knights. But behind the myth, many historians believed a real leader may indeed have existed. A war commander in post-Roman Britain whose victories became the foundation for centuries of storytelling. His real name might even have been different. Still, through 15 centuries of memory and imagination, that shadowy figure became immortal. Without Arthur's legend, Britain's cultural memory might have looked very different. Medieval kings used Arthur to justify power. Poets turned him into the model of heroism and chivalry. Entire traditions of literature grew from his story. And history judged Arthur unfairly in two opposite ways. Some dismissed him entirely as fantasy. Others accepted medieval romance as literal fact. The truth likely rested somewhere between them. A real conflict probably happened. A real leader may have emerged from it. But generations transformed memory into myth until the original figure became almost impossible to see clearly. Most rulers vanished after death. Their kingdoms collapsed. Their names disappeared into dust. Arthur, whether fully real or partly imagined, survived for 15 centuries. That alone made him extraordinary. So perhaps the deeper question was not whether Arthur existed, but why so many generations needed him to exist. Was Arthur truly one historical war leader, Or did Britain create him by combining the memories of many forgotten fighters into a single immortal figure? And if the real Arthur could finally be uncovered beneath centuries of myth, would the truth feel more powerful than the legend itself? For more stories where history and myth collided in the ancient world, subscribe and continue the journey into the forgotten past.